Hey folks, so let's start in on the second chapter of rigorous reading and move on and see what we see inside. I want you to take a look at the beginning, the first page or so, where they describe a particular teacher teaching a particular skill to her students. And it's an elementary classroom, and it's the book Number the Stars, which is an atrocious book that you should never teach. It's often a middle school book, and it's a really bad Holocaust novel that is factually inaccurate. But that's another issue. Anyway, I want you to take a look at how the lesson unfolds and the steps that the teacher goes through, because I think they are an example of our expectations of the things that you will do in a lesson. Now, how they are ordered, and that's why I really want you to think about breaking it down into the steps that she does, how it's ordered might change depending on the occasion, but the sense of the elements of the lesson are valuable. And so take a look at that and think about it. And maybe I'll remember to talk about it in class. Now, here's where we get into the idea of modeling. And that's an essential part of everything that we tell you to do in your lesson plans. Modeling is what we do when we show someone what an expert does with a particular skill. So in your classes, you are the expert in the room when it comes to reading and probably a lot of other things. And your students do have expertises which you want to tap, but here you are the expert reader in the room, and you need to model for them the kinds of skills that good readers do. Now, a lot of those skills are intuitive to you, so you've got to stop and think about what the steps are to being a good reader. How did you get to your level of skill? Because you're going to have to teach that to your students. So on the bottom of page 22 of the Fisher and Fry text, they have this bulleted list of items, and I think I've adapted it for this little slide here. But think about these 6 skills or strategies that good readers do. And you can take a look at them. They're pretty self-evident here. The thing I want you to think about is, in the same way that we unpack our standards, you need to unpack these skills. So if number 1 is analyze authorial choices, you've got to think about, what does that mean? What are authorial choices? How does one go about analyzing them? What are the steps to that analysis? And what do we do once we identify those authorial choices and analyze them? The idea of making predictions. How do we go about doing that? How do I look at something and begin to think about what's coming next? And what I could anticipate happening in the text? You've got to show them, and you've got to do it by identifying the skills that are aligned with predictions. Same thing with questioning, same thing with identifying, and even what are text structures. The same thing is looking at what the writer wants us to think or see or feel or do as readers. What are the tools that the writer has at his or her disposal? And what does it mean to tap prior knowledge? And how do we even go about doing that? So this list doesn't function as it stands. You need to unpack each of these strategies. And given that there are really 6 key strategies to what good readers do, even after you unpack them, it's not an onerous amount of work for you. Now, it's important to know that there's no one way and there's no right way to teach a complex text. And in our last discussion, our little chat, we talked about the idea of a complex text. And that text is built on in this chapter. The essential point is we have to choose texts that require our support. If a reader can read a text on his or her own, then you know what? They can read it on their own. They don't need to be reading it and thinking about it and analyzing it in class. It doesn't belong as part of our direct instruction. The other point that's made in this chapter is that we have to implement a variety of classroom approaches for teaching a complex text. And here are 4 of the approaches that they talk about: close reading, collaborative conversations, partner reading, and independent reading. We're going to do each of these during the course of our semester, and I'm going to ask you to implement some of these into your lesson plans. You want to build into your lessons opportunities to do all of these. It creates a diverse learning experience about the same text. And Fisher and Fry offer a planning document on pages 24 and 25. If you have your book, grab it. If not, go and get it. Because on the next slide, I'm going to give you an assignment based on using this planning tool. This assignment also appears under the list of assignments, and it's included on your syllabus. And I'm just going to read it, even though I hate reading to you. But I'm asking you to use a version of that planning document on pages 24 and 25. And it's also, a version of it is on Canvas. It's linked to the assignment. And I'm going to ask you to develop a brief lesson teaching one of the skills that was listed on our previous slide about the skills you want to teach, the ones that you need to unpack. Your lesson should address this skill in the context of something from the first 50 pages of the novel we are reading in class. I'm not saying the name of that novel because sometimes I use these videos, or I might be able to use this video, since I'm making it for the first time now, with a different class. But, oh, well, all right, we're reading Hard Times. So use it choose something from the first 50 pages of Hard Times and go back to those bulleted skills that are on I think I said the bottom of page 22, and they're also on a previous slide, so you could back up if you want, and come up with a lesson for teaching that. And you can read more about this assignment on the under assignments on Canvas. The thing about this planning tool is that it's really ideal for formative assessment. And I think it's figure 1.2, no, 2.1, whatever, in chapter 2, the one on page 24 and 25. I want you to complete all of the steps except the one about reflection, because you will not have taught the lesson, so you can't reflect. But if you look at the model I created based on that, that's just a Word doc, you'll see that I've made a couple of changes and tweaked it especially about assessment. So take a look at it either now or after you read this, and or if you listen to this, and we can think about how to use that form. So bring any questions you might have to class. In choosing what to model, you've got to be able to think from the perspective of your student. And in the chapter from Fisher and Fry, they talk about these sort of 4 things that you need to think about modeling for them, and you've got to think about what they look like when we're approaching a text. And so, I've got some things flying in here, so let's see if they work. So for the first one, what will challenge your students? Look back at the factors of text complexity on page 9 of the text for challenges. Those factors of text complexity are also, or maybe it's aspects of text complexity, I can't remember. They're also part of one of the lesson plans you'll be doing. I don't know whether that's been assigned yet or not. Anyway, you have to begin to think of what will challenge your students, and that means you've got to be able to look around your room and think about the kinds of challenges, not only the entire class, but individual students or groups of students might face when they're addressing the text that you've selected to teach. Oh, look at it, flew in and out. I'm very proud of myself. Let's see if the next one comes in. Perfect. When you're talking about the reading problems that will frustrate them, the text itself will present some problems. When we talk about reader response at some point or other in the semester, one of the things we have to remember is that the text brings something to the conversation. The text, in the transaction between reader and text, the text brings its integrity, the elements, the aesthetic elements the text has that we can't get away from. So what about those elements might prove challenging to the students in your class? So you need to anticipate the challenges and the challenges that will face your particular students, and you have to teach them how to address those challenges, how do you tackle those challenges, and provide them resources. So if it is a text that is bound to a particular time in history, kind of like Hard Times, what resources on that period, on Victorian England, on the Industrial Revolution and the rise of industry in the northern parts of England during this time, what resources can you give them that they can go and find more, or do some background reading, or just engage themselves more with the details of the text? You need to be able to provide those particular resources to students. The next bullet is, how do they interact with a text that is unfamiliar? And here, oh damn, my little arrow doesn't go over far enough, and I'm not going to fuck with the window space because I always screw it up. Anyway, you have to offer direct instruction on how to interact with a text. And we think about that as with annotating our text or using sticky notes. And I always tell the story about how when I first went to college and back in the day, there were no computers. It was a million years ago. It was 1975 or 76. Anyway, for the first time, I bought highlighters. Because you always got your books at school and you used those books and you weren't allowed to write in them. And there was no such thing as Post-its. So I got a pack of highlighters, yellow, blue, pink, and green. And I had this whole system for highlighting so that the frickin' pages of my books were just like rainbows. But I could never remember. In one chapter, yellow would be for the main ideas, but in another one, it would be for evidence. So it was a complete clusterfuck. So we need to teach students how to annotate using sticky notes or using marginal notes. I've posted in Canvas under like general resources an essay by Mortimer Adler called How to Mark a Book, and it's dated. It's from like the 50s, I think. But what I like about it is it's about being passionate about the books that you own, and it also gives you some guidelines. And there's a tons of places that you can go online, just Google annotating a text, and you'll find all kinds of teacher resources for that. I'm a big fan of the Adler one though, and I'm a really big fan of reviewing my students' annotations. Peter goes around and looks at students' books to see how they're annotating. And it does make a difference if they're juniors or freshmen. It's the idea of watching a student engage with a text. Bye, Arrow. And lastly, as the expert reader in the room, you have to model not just reading a complex text, but reading all kinds of texts. And here my point is that you have to have a bag of tricks, an arrow, a quiver full of arrows of strategies that you use when you approach a text. These sort of cognitive strategies that you use. But those strategies differ depending upon the type of text. I don't need to use the same diligence in a John Grisham novel as I do when I'm reading, Derrida. I'm not carrying a pencil around to highlight things, although often when I'm reading a trashy novel, I actually do find things that can connect to the real world and to what I'm doing in the classroom. But I digress. The point is, students need to know that each reading occasion has its own set of required skills for making meaning, not unlike each writing occasion having different use of evidence or a different tone or a different voice or a different format. And your job is to allow them to engage with these various ways. One of the things, and I think I mentioned this in the Think Aloud slide that I'm going to do next, but I can't remember, so I'll say it here. One of the things I love to do with students to show them that different texts require different skills and that I sometimes struggle with confronting new texts is saying to a student, bring me something. Everybody bring into class a text. Find something that you want me to read. You can give it to me and watch me do a think aloud. And that cracks me up because sometimes they bring in like really weird stuff, songs I can't even figure out and whatever, or complex poetry. Somebody once brought me in like directions from IKEA to build something. Whatever it is, it's this idea of my being a willing participant in this modeling of cognitive skills that says, regardless, that the skills that we use are dependent on the kind of text we're trying to read. Okay, way too much babbling there. So, now this is the thinking out loud one. And this is where, in the chapter, Fisher and Fry spend quite a bit of time on the idea of conducting a think aloud because it is such an essential skill. I mean, it's like when you go play tennis, you watch somebody who's good, like when the what do you call it? Like Wimbledon is on, or the French Open, or when I was growing up, the U.S. Open in Forest Hills, because my dad was raised in Forest Hills. Anyway, when you'd watch it, you'd like watch them on TV, and you'd like want to go play right away because you saw stuff and you want to implement what you saw from those experts. And that's the same thing with readers. Your think alouds in all the various occasions in which you can use them are an example for them to see what an expert does. So that's why it's such an important element, and that's why Fisher and Fry spend so much time on it. So although it seems like it should be easy to model how to engage a text, being systematic in the way you conduct the think aloud will make sure you hit all the high notes. Because remember, reading a text for you is intuitive. It's become second nature. It's no longer this idea of first I do this, then I do this, then I do this. You just do it from memory, by rote. And you've got to go back and and think about what those steps are. So this slide and Fisher and Fry on page 35, they list the kinds of steps to which you should attend. And I think that that's an important element to look at. So let's take a look at each of these steps and go through them one at a time. The first step is naming the strategy, the skill, or the task. And there are going to be times during the semester where I say, when you're approaching teaching literature, sometimes just read the frickin' text and then talk about the particular literary element, or talk about a particular skill. But first start by engaging the text. That's different from this kind of think aloud, because you want them to be thinking about the skill that you are modeling, or the strategy, or the task while they are watching it. So there's a little bit of a difference there. And when we get to talking about literature in more detail, we'll try and remember the distinction and take a look at it again. Stating the purpose of the strategy or skill goes back to being purposeful. And I have, we're going to talk in class quite a bit about the idea of being purposeful. And that is a large section of Chapter 2 of Rigorous Reading. The I statements are just a way that students will associate those steps, they'll associate what's happening with you as the expert reader. So you don't want them to be thinking a good reader. No, I do. I'm your teacher. I'm a good reader. Trust me. I'm not trying to make you into some model perfect reader that you don't know. Look at me. If you trust me, and by now you want your students to, you should know that building that trust is essential. If they trust you, then watching you do it and watching you model and watching you succeed will be sufficient. But the I statements help remind them to trust you. The fourth is demonstrating how it's used, and that's by working through a passage. You know, I think Fisher and Fry say this. If they don't, I'm saying it. If you can display the passage, or or put it on, give them a handout of it. Let them see exactly what you're doing when you annotate. Don't just say I'd underline here. Have it on a screen and show them the underline. For those of you who've been in literature classes with me, when I do those model essays, I use those bubble comments on the side to explain my thinking, or as Stacy would say, to metacognate. I don't even think that's a word. But anyway, the idea that I want you to see the kinds of things I'm doing. It shouldn't be a mystery. Expertise should not be a mystery. Expertise should be something I show you so you can do it yourself. The next is alerting readers about errors to avoid. And that's important because you've got to tell students, look at, especially when we're talking about complex text. And Kelly Gallagher says this in Read Aside. You got to say, or is it Deeper Reading? One of those two. Anyway, you've got to say to them, look at this text is hard. I understand that, but the rewards are worth it. And so here are the things to look for. Here are the challenges you might have. And if you encounter these challenges, here are the things that you can do. So you've got to prepare them. What stuns students is this moment when they look at something and they're like totally freaking lost. I always tell the story, another story, about opening up the Kristeva Reader, which was a theory text I was assigned. And I'm reading the introduction written by another theorist named Toril Moy. And I can't fucking make sense of a single word of the introduction. And I'm sitting there saying to myself, I can't be this stupid. I mean, maybe I am that stupid, but I didn't think I was back then. And I wish somebody had just prepared me and said, look this introduction is really complicated. So slow down, or here are a couple resources that might help you get through it. It's the same way when I teach the Scarlet Letter. I never start with the Custom House chapter because it is so boring. And so, students hate the Scarlet Letter because that's the first thing they read, this boring opening section of it, the opening chapter. We go back and take a look at it later on, or you can warn students this is going to be really frickin' boring. But that's not a good tack. I say just skip it. It's not essential to the text, and you can come back to it. Just if you ever teach the Scarlet Letter, which you should. Anyway, back to the idea of alerting your students. Here are the challenges. Here are the roadblocks. Be prepared for them. Anticipate them and either work through them in this way or bring them to class. And that's always a good thing. When students bring challenges to class, it's a real opportunity to teach because you think one student is struggling, everybody's struggling. Finally, you want to be explicit when you finish about the usefulness, about how these strategies helped you make sense of things. And You know how I tell all these pointless stories to you? In reality, they're not pointless stories. They're my chance to model using yourself as an example. Because you were once these students, and I was once you guys, and I was once these students. And so the idea of letting them know that you're speaking from your own experience, from your own struggles, I think goes a long way. So share those experiences with your students. And I believe, if I am right, that's my last slide for this chapter, because we're going to talk about the idea of purpose in class. Otherwise, that's it. So go back and look at the assignment that I created, that I talk about above, and I'll see you in class. Okie doke. Bye, guys.